Welcome to another episode of FinStecks. Today we're diving straight into a really complex situation brewing between the U.S. and China. We're looking at how trade tariffs and, the potential shakeup of TikTok's U.S. operations are all tangled up together.
Exactly. It's quite a mix. We've got a fascinating stack of sources to unpack for you today, from Business Insider, Reuters.
Politico too, right?
Yeah, Politico, ABC News, Spectrum Local News, the South China Morning Post, and PBS. So, yeah, a lot of different angles on these significant developments.
Okay, so our mission today is really to cut through the noise, try and figure out what the core strategies are, on both sides of this, and really understand the bigger implications for U.S.-China relations and, well, obviously what the future might hold for TikTok right here in America. All right, so first off, it looks like President Trump is drawing a pretty clear line, almost explicitly linking this TikTok deal with the broader trade negotiations with China.
Yeah, what's really striking is just how explicit that connection has become. I mean, Trump has openly suggested that if Beijing, gives the green light to a TikTok divestment that satisfies U.S. concerns,
Then maybe the tariffs come down.
that seems to be the implication, yeah. He'd consider easing up on those tariffs on Chinese goods. It's a pretty direct way of using one issue to try and gain leverage on another.
And he even put a pretty bold number on it. I think I saw a quote where he said something like, every percentage point of tariffs equates to more revenue than TikTok itself.
Wow.
Yeah, that really shines a light on the strategic importance he's placing on this, doesn't it? Like, it feels like it's not just about national security concerns anymore, maybe.
That's a crucial point to consider. This kind of direct linkage is, well, it's somewhat unusual in these big international trade discussions. Usually, security matters and economic policies are sort of handled in different lanes.
Right.
Trump's approach here signals a potential shift, maybe using non-economic factors for economic advantage. That's a tactic that could have some significant ripple effects down the line.
And the timing, it seems significant, too.
It does. Our sources indicate that the pause or the delay in the TikTok deal process sort of coincided with reports that China was reaching out for trade talks.
After the U.S. had already increased tariffs.
Exactly, after those tariff hikes. So it certainly suggests a calculated move,
Okay, so let's zoom in on this TikTok divestment saga itself. Because honestly, it feels like we've been hearing about this for a while now.
We definitely have. It all stems from that 2024 law, doesn't it? The one that essentially told ByteDance, TikTok's parent company,
Sell or get banned, basically.
pretty much, sell off TikTok's U.S. operations to a buyer the U.S. government approved or face a nationwide ban. And the Supreme Court upheld that law earlier this year, back in January 2025, which set that initial deadline for ByteDance to make a move.
And wasn't there a specific deal being floated, the one led by Vice President J.D. Vance? I remember reading about that.
Yes, that's right. The proposed deal involved a consortium of American investors, big names like Oracle, Blackstone.
Andreessen Horowitz was in there too, I think.
Yes, Andreessen Horowitz as well. The whole idea was to get majority American ownership of TikTok, with ByteDance keeping just a minority stake, crucially, below that 20% threshold that had been talked about.
But these deadlines, they just keep getting pushed back, it seems. We've had, 2 extensions now?
That's right. The initial April 5th deadline got extended by 75 days through an executive order, and that was actually the second extension.
Ah, okay.
And some users might even remember, after the first extension expired, TikTok actually went dark for a bit in the U.S., didn't it, before being restored?
Oh, yeah, I remember that brief blackout. It definitely underscored the uncertainty around the whole thing.
For sure. And ByteDance themselves acknowledged talks were ongoing, but importantly, they emphasized that no final agreement had actually been reached. So it still feels very, very fluid.
Totally. And Trump's recent comment saying the ball is in China's court, well, that really highlights his stance, doesn't it?
And his confidence, perhaps, that a very good deal is still on the table. It puts the pressure, the onus, squarely back on Beijing.
Okay, now let's switch gears a bit and look at the tariff escalations and how China's been reacting. Because it sounds like a real back and forth, almost like a trade war heating up again.
It really is a classic tit-for-tat scenario. And the speed of the escalation is, well, it's quite notable. Back in April 2025, remember, the U.S. slapped that 34% tariff on Chinese goods.
And China responded immediately.
Instantly, no hesitation. They immediately matched it with a 34% tariff on all goods coming from the U.S.
Wow. Okay. And it didn't stop there, did it? There were threats of even higher tariffs.
Oh yeah, it kept going. When the U.S. floated the idea of an additional 50% tariff, China quickly upped its retaliatory tariffs way up to 84%.
84%.
Yeah, significant. And then this escalation just continued. The U.S. then raised its tariffs to a whopping 125%.
And China matched it again.
Predictably, yes. China matched that increase too. I mean, these are substantial tariffs. They can really, really impact the flow of goods between the two biggest economies.
So we're talking about some pretty hefty taxes flying back and forth.
Yeah.
But it sounds like China's response went beyond just, mirroring the tariffs. They did other things too.
That's a really key aspect of this, actually. China hasn't just played the tariff game. They've deployed a much more comprehensive set of retaliatory measures.
Like what?
Well, for starters, imposing export restrictions on rare earth materials and critical minerals. Now, for listeners who aren't familiar, these are absolutely essential components in loads of advanced technology.
Right, like phones, computers, defense tech.
Exactly. And the U.S. relies heavily on China for a significant chunk of its supply. So restricting those exports gives China considerable leverage, a real pressure point.
Yeah, that could have some serious knock-on effects for all sorts of industries. What other steps have they taken?
Well, they've also added U.S. defense and tech companies to their unreliable entity list.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Think of it like a blacklist, almost. It's a tool China can use to restrict or even completely block companies they decide are harmful to their national interests from operating within China. So it gives them significant influence over foreign businesses there.
Okay.
Beyond that, they've suspended imports of American agricultural products that hits farmers hard. They've launched what look like some pretty targeted anti-dumping investigations against U.S. companies, and they've even filed formal complaints with the World Trade Organization, the WTO, arguing that the U.S. tariffs are actually illegal under international trade rules.
Wow, so that's a pretty wide-ranging response then.
Yeah.
Sounds like the Chinese Commerce Ministry is taking a very, very firm stance.
Absolutely. Their official statement was quite strong. They declared they would fight to the end against what they see as typical unilateral bullying practice, and they stated very clearly they'd take all necessary countermeasures. It really underscores the high level of tension and, their resolve to defend their economic interests.
Okay, so let's try and connect all these pieces now, the whole TikTok situation, these escalating tariffs, China's multifaceted response. What's the bigger picture here? What do we think might be Trump's sort of underlying strategy?
Well, this really raises a super important question for us to consider, right? Is the U.S. government's concern about TikTok primarily a national security issue? Or is it also being used, perhaps quite deliberately, as a strategic tool to gain leverage in these broader trade negotiations with China?
It feels like it could be both, but...
Given how explicitly the two seem to be linked now, it's probably a combination, yeah. But the timing and those public statements we talked about, they certainly suggest that TikTok is, at least in part, being used as a pretty significant bargaining chip in this whole economic dance.
And flipping it around, how might China be interpreting all of this? What do you think their main priorities are likely to be right now?
Well, from Beijing's perspective, these intertwined actions probably feel like a concerted pressure campaign. They're facing these huge tariffs, which obviously impact their export-driven economy, and at the same time, the potential loss of a major global platform like TikTok in a really key market.
So what are they trying to achieve?
Their priorities seem kind of twofold. First, vigorously protect their economic interests and their global standing. And second, to push back hard against what they perceive as unilateral and, frankly, unfair actions being taken by the United States.
So thinking about the real-world impact, what are the potential consequences of this standoff for everyday life? For, the millions of people using TikTok here in America, for the broader U.S.-China trade relationship, and maybe even for the global economy?
Yeah, the implications could be quite far-reaching. For American TikTok users, obviously, the uncertainty surrounding the platform's future is still a significant issue. Is it going to be here tomorrow? Will it change?
Right.
For U.S.-China trade more broadly, these increasing tariffs, well, they can translate pretty directly to higher costs for businesses, and guess who often ends up paying for that?
Consumers, usually.
Exactly, passed on to consumers. Plus, it can seriously disrupt established supply chains that businesses rely on. And when you step back and consider the sheer scale of these two economies, any significant trade friction between the U.S. and China can inject a whole lot of instability and uncertainty into the entire global economic landscape.
It really does feel like we're in a moment of significant uncertainty, doesn't it? With a number of different potential outcomes still very much in play.
Precisely. The future of TikTok in the U.S. and the overall direction, the trajectory of U.S.-China trade relations, It's all heavily contingent on these ongoing negotiations, and fundamentally on the willingness of both sides to find some common ground, maybe make some concessions.
So as you can clearly see, this situation between the U.S. and China involving trade and TikTok is it's far from simple. It's a really dynamic interplay of economic strategy, political maneuvering, and of course, technological implications.
Yeah, and the way our sources really highlight that direct connection being forged between the tariffs and the TikTok deal, it really illustrates a novel, maybe even unprecedented approach to navigating these tricky international trade negotiations.
And China's strong response, not just matching the tariffs, but implementing those wider countermeasures we discussed, definitely underscores the significant stakes involved in this complex situation.
Absolutely. Ultimately, the future of TikTok here in the U.S. and the broader path of U.S.-China trade relations, well, they remain quite uncertain. And they're clearly very heavily reliant on how these continuing discussions play out and, the potential for compromise on both sides.
Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more updates on the issue.